Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I will discuss about conditional routing in WebMethods API Gateway 10x versions. We can segregate the topic in two parts. So first we will discuss when we can use conditional routing, and then we'll show how we can implement conditional routing in API Gateway. So first I will explain when you should use conditional routing in API Gateway. So for that, I am just taking one example of simple math services. You can see this package. This is demo math package. Here you can find 4 flow services for addition, division, multiplication and subtraction. For each services I have related REST services. So for addition this is the REST service, for division this is the one, for multiplication this one, and for subtraction so on. For each REST service I have corresponding REST API descriptor, as you can see. Now what I want to do is I want to virtualize only one API in API Gateway, and I want that API to call this REST services based on a particular condition. To merge the math services in one API, what we can do is we can create an API in the API Gateway that will take a header value which is called operation. Inside operation you can pass, add, divide, subtract and multiply, and then there will be one body num1 and num2 where you will pass the actual numbers, and based on the operation the API will pass the request to corresponding REST services. Those are present in integration server. Then the API will return the value in results, and if you are not passing a correct operation, in that case that the API will return invalid input. For creating API we will use a Swagger file. So for that we are opening the Swagger descriptor of one of the REST API descriptor that we created in IS. So we'll copy this Swagger file and we'll create a YML Swagger file here, and then paste the content that we copied from the REST API descriptor. We'll rename this file since API Gateway accepts YML file, so we'll rename this file as math.yml. Click on yes. Then we'll go to API Gateway, we'll create the API, select the API YML file for creating the API from file, and then we'll name the API as math API, and type we'll choose as Swagger since it's a Swagger file, and then we'll click on create. Now the API is created. You can see now the API is created. So we'll go to the policy, and there in the routing policy is the place where we can implement the conditional routing. By default, when you create one API, the default routing is straight through routing, and the endpoint URI that you see here, that is being picked up from the Swagger file that we chose while creating the API. So we will modify this straight through routing to conditional routing, but before that we will make a change in the API. So since we have created the API from a particular Swagger file, so you can see it took the resource name as multiply numbers, but we want the resource name that will be applicable for all the math operations, right? So we will modify this resource name first here. So we'll give something like operate numbers that will make sense for all the math operations, and then we'll save it. After that we'll go to the policies. Now we will delete the straight through routing policy and then add conditional routing policy. So in conditional routing you have to give one default path. So I just copied the one path from straight through routing, and then I'm giving that path as default path for now. Then you have to add rule for each condition. Okay. So first we will add rule for addition, right? So for addition, what we want to check is if the value of operation that is being passed in header is equal to add or not. So here in the values you have to give operation, right? And then you have to check whether the value is add. If it is add, then you can pass the request to addition REST service, right? So for that you have to give the endpoint URI of addition REST service. To get the endpoint URI of addition REST service, we'll go back to IS. We'll go to the REST API descriptor that is describing the REST service addition, and then we'll build the endpoint URI. Okay, this way. And after that you have to add the resource name, right, which is add numbers. Yeah, this is the path, so you have to copy that. I have to paste it. So now this is my complete URL, so I will just copy this URI and then I will paste it to the add condition endpoint URI. So yeah, now my condition is ready. So you can see, similar to addition, we will add conditions for other operations like division, multiply, and subtraction. We will add the header variable in the similar way like we added for multiply and addition. So if the header value is divide, then the API gateway will route the request to division REST services in IS. So we'll generate the endpoint URI from REST API descriptor like all the other operations. So now the rule for addition, division, and multiplication is added. So we'll add the last rule, which is for subtraction. We'll follow the same process that we followed for the other operations. You can see now all my 4 conditions are ready, but still it will not allow you to add the conditional routing because you have to give one default endpoint URI. I am giving one random URI for the time being. Later on we will show how you can create a default API for this case. Save the conditional routing policy and I'll activate the API. Okay. Now we'll test the API using Postman. Okay. I have already copied the path from API gateway. In body you can see we are passing to variable number 1 and number 2. Okay. Now in header we will pass the operation that we defined in conditional routing. So we'll just copy the variable name from API gateway and we'll paste it in Postman and we'll start testing. So first we'll test for add. Yes, you can see for addition it's working. Okay. Now we'll test for division. The next operation result should be 1. Let's see. Yes, it is working. Now we'll test for multiply and yes, it is working. Now finally we'll test for subtraction and it's working fine as you can see. So for all the conditions that we have defined in conditional routing section policies in the API gateway, they are all working fine. Now we will consider the scenario where the user is not passing any valid value in the operation. So for that case, the request will route to the URI that we mentioned in the default URI section in the conditional routing policies. So for that, either you can create a API in the API gateway that will handle those, default inputs, or you can write service in IS and then give that IS service path to that default URI section of conditional routing. So for our case, what we'll do is we will create an API in API gateway and then we'll copy the path of that default API and then we'll add it in the default URI section of our previous API in conditional routing and try to handle the invalid inputs. Let's see how we can do that. Okay. So we are creating the default API that will handle our invalid inputs. So naming it as default math API. After that, I am giving the technical information and saving the API. Now the API is created. Okay. We'll add a resource to the API and we'll name it as, default resource and we'll give the proper path, tick the postman and the resource is created. After that, what we will do is we will do a API mocking in this API. For API mocking, you have to select this option enable mocking and once you select enable mocking, you can mock the API response. So we have one resource in the API that is default resource. So for that, we are going to mock the response. So we will add a response for status code 200, for example. We'll click on add and then we'll expand it and we'll add content type. Here we'll select application JSON and we'll select the mock response that we want to display when user is passing any kind of invalid input in the header field in the math API. Now we'll save it and Once it is saved, we'll activate the API. Now the API is activated, so we'll copy this gateway endpoint and we'll go to the math API, we'll go to policies, we'll go to conditional routing policy. Okay, then we will modify this default path. We'll click on edit, and then in the default routing path we will just keep the path of the API that we created to handle default cases. And along with the API we also have to give the resource path. Okay, so let's go to the default default API, and then we'll copy the resource. Okay, and then we'll paste it here, and then we'll click on OK and save the math API. And now we will test it from the postman. So in header we will pass any wrong value. So yes, you can see since we have passed a wrong value, the request is routed to the default API and the result is displaying as invalid input. I hope you understood it. If you have any questions, you can use the comment section or you can directly contact with me in my email ID. So that's all for today. We'll see you in the next video. Till then, bye bye. Take care.